Good afternoon. My name is Agne Gurevičienė, and I say labas to everyone from the Consulate General of Lithuania in Los Angeles. Today, May the 7th, is known as Lithuanian Press Restoration Language and Book Day, and therefore there's no better way to celebrate and to commemorate it than in a great company of two renowned Lithuanian American authors, Birute Putrius and Professor Violeta Kelertas. They are book readers, book writers, book translators, editors, and I hope you already had a chance to read Birute Putrius' book, The Last Book Smuggler. If not, I strongly recommend you, encourage you to do it. This is not only a story about the unique phenomenon of book smuggling in Lithuania, when Lithuanian books and schools were banned. It is also an inspiring love story full of historical details, information about Lithuanian traditions, customs, beliefs, rituals. And without further ado, I now give the floor, or I should say maybe the screen, to Professor Violeta Kelertas and Birute Putrius for the open and honest conversation. And if you would have any questions or comments, please either raise your virtual hand or write them down in Q&A section. Violeta, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Agna. I have the pleasure of today introducing Birute Putrius to the audience. There was a time when I did not know Birute, and I used to organize literary readings at the Santara conference in Chicago with various writers from North America. And at one point, somebody said, you know, there's a woman who in Los Angeles who writes books. And I pricked up my ears immediately. And that was that they eventually gave me, they couldn't remember her name, but eventually I got her email address. And the email address was the first clue to who Birute is. Many, if not most of us, are Lithuanian patriots, but I remember being struck by her email address of that time, some 20 years ago, because it included the word Baltic. I haven't encountered anything like that since. And I could say this of her today, that she is a special kind of patriot. Although she taught English literature at one point in her life, her heart and soul are devoted to Lithuania. She has written she had been writing short stories in America and publishing them in American literary journals. Most of these, or maybe all of them, I don't know, ended up in her first novel of linked short stories called Lost Birds, about Market Park Lithuanians in Chicago. And this book was translated and published just last year in Lithuanian. Alma Litera was the publisher, and it's called Paklydę Paukščiai, if anybody wants to find it in Lithuanian rather than in English. It seems to me, and actually she's put the idea in my head anyway, that one of her goals in writing is to explain what Lithuanians are all about to English-speaking audiences. And I think that's a very important thing to be doing because, you know, many writers, we have many writers in North America today from those who write about exile, about exiles or their parents or their grandparents coming to America. And but when Birute writes about it, it's clearer because she sticks in very cleverly. She sticks in historical detail, and it's not didactic or obnoxious or anything. She really has a knack for it, and I admire her for it. She writes constantly, as you will find out, and that The Last Book Smuggler is part one of a planned trilogy. She is currently working on volume 2, Winter Flowers, and volume 3 is already buzzing in her head. And I will proceed now and let her shine with her answers to my questions. So the first question would be, when did you start writing? How did you start writing? And do you plan and outline your novels in advance? I'm curious.
Oh, well, I feel like I've been writing my whole life, to tell you the truth. And I remember with my friend Milda, my best friend in grammar school, we used to write stories, and I would write fairy tales one after the other, and she would write detective stories. And we'd share them and read them to each other and write book reports and things. But when I started writing, truly seriously writing, I started writing screenplays for 2 years. At UCLA, I was studying this, and I was writing these tremendously long treatments and outlines. And then for every scene in the movie, we had to write a 3x5 card and put them in a shoebox. And so we would know at any point where the movie was. Well, by the time I wrote all of that, I wasn't interested in the story. It's like we wrung all the juice out of a story. And I no longer wanted to write it. All the life of it had gone out of it for me. So I decided, and I was such a movie buff. My brother weaned me on Ingmar Bergman, and and I was a big Fellini and foreign film buff. And I thought, oh, how wonderful to be a screenwriter. Well, I threw that all away and decided, no, I think I was pregnant with my daughter at that point, which was probably in the mid 80s. And at that point I said, well, I can't keep a 120-page screenplay in my head. I'm going to write short stories. Started writing short stories. I went to UCLA to a class where a very well-known and published writer, Sam Eisenstein, started teaching me how to write a short story. And he loved my short stories so much that he invited me into his writing group, which had been going since, decades already. So joining his writing class, we were forced to bring something in every 2 weeks. And so you like it or not, you do it. And I was, working full time. I was raising children. I was, taking care of the house and cooking. It's, for women, it's much harder than for men. If you're Hemingway, you've got someone cooking for you. And if, you don't need to take care of the children, the wife will do it for you. So I always said every writer needs a wife so that they could quietly go off and write. But I used to put my children to bed in the summers, and then I would sit at the computer till 4 o'clock in the morning, listening to classical music and writing and writing and writing. And now I have a whole file cabinet full of versions of novels and stories that need rewriting desperately. And God willing, if I have time, I'll get into them and finish them. So that's my whole writing career. And I still am in the same writing group, still coming. This Sunday will be a meeting. We're now doing it by Zoom, like everything else in the world since COVID. And I will dutifully show up with my new pages and read them to the group. They've been tremendous critics over the years, have really taught me a lot. And so I shall continue.
I see you've dedicated this book to your grandfather, who was a book smuggler. Is The Last Book Smuggler based on your family story?
Well, it is and it isn't, because my father was a tremendous storyteller and a writer himself. He used to write for a group in Lithuania called the Pavasarininkai, and he's written his memoirs, one big part of which is lost, and I only have the last part of it during World War I. But he was a great storyteller, and so he told me this story. He told me lots of stories. The Duma voice story in this book, for example, about his Tata Kotrina, came directly from his lips into the book, and he also told me about having gone into East Prussia with his father on a trip in the horse and wagon and coming back. And only when he came back did his father tell him that they had smuggled things from East Prussia, including books, but not only books, but brandy and cigars or something along those lines, maybe tobacco, I don't know. So all of these things were in my mind, and they would sort of take on a life of their own. And, he always called me a mieszczanka, which means a city girl. I knew nothing about farms. I'd say, what was life like in Lithuania? How many cows did you have? How many sheep, And he would tell me these stories, but I would have no context for them whatsoever. And not until I went to Lithuania did I have a context for them. But I would constantly try to imagine what this life was like for them. So this imagining he would plant a seed in my mind, and that seed would grow, and a whole life started forming. And I started looking into these things. And luckily I had someone mentor me, someone named Jonas Balys, who was in Baltimore, who had written all of these books on folklore and mythology. And so one by one, he sent them all to me, worm-eaten. They were all written in Germany in the DP camps. They were already falling apart, but he sent them to me. I paid for them. And, I would call him and ask him questions about various things. So much of what I learned from him is in this book, The Last Book Smuggler.
Interesting that you write. I got those books too, but I decided that they were boring and I never actually read them much.
Fascinated by
But
that.
you have to find the right audience. So what was your grandfather's journey like? What challenges were often faced along the way, and was he ever almost caught?
I don't know the answer to that story, because the only thing that he told me was that he learned about the book smuggling afterwards, and that his father had made a compartment under the wagon, a special secret compartment, so that in case they were stopped by the gendarmes, and the penalties were terrible, jail, Siberia, and certainly if you didn't stop at the border, they'd shoot you. So the penalties were terrible. So why he would take my father along on the trip, I don't know. But I guess because he had made this, and people made all sorts of secret compartments. Women smuggled books in their specially made skirts that they could slip books and newspapers into. So there were a variety of ways, and I'm sure it was dangerous, but a whole army of people did it, and they did it for 40 years. So bravo to them.
That's very interesting. I wonder if he brought the son along, your father along, to be sort of like a decoy or something, to make it look more not normal, not just one man or two men, but somebody who was younger. I don't know.
That could very well be, but we also had relatives who lived in the part of East Prussia that was called Lithuania Minor. And so people would go across the border to visit one way and the other. So it was not unusual that people went, and maybe having a son along made it look like it was going to be simply a family visit and not something else.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me was when I found out that it wasn't just men smuggling, actually women smuggled, children smuggled, and some of them got paid for it. I mean, there's a whole history of it that you can't cover in one book, but it's a very interesting topic. Book smuggling was not only a way to rebel against the Russian Empire, but also a way to keep the language alive for the Lithuanian people. What is your sense of how the people reacted when the books would arrive?
Well, Lithuania, because, it had been under Russian rule since, 1795. And after that big insurrection in
1863.
63, they sent Moraviev there with an edict, make me a Lithuania with nothing Lithuanian in it. The literacy rate had gone down. I mean, the literacy rate was very low in Lithuania at that point, but it became, the nobility was all Polonized. They all spoke Polish and thought Lithuania was just a peasant's tongue. But the farmers were very, very stubborn, and they wanted to keep the language alive. And I think it became a point of honor to have these books in your home. They're hidden, of course, and all sorts of, some people hid them in things that look like beehives, but they weren't beehives. They were places to hide books. They hid them all sorts of ways, but it became a point of honor to learn how to read and write in Lithuanian. The literacy rate over the 40 years that the book ban was in place, the literacy rate rose very much. And not only that, but it became, I think, a rallying point for the whole nationalist cause, this idea of resurrecting Lithuania's independence. So I think it was tremendous. I think there were a lot of exiles who went to East Prussia so that they wouldn't be jailed, and they started working towards this idea of independence and the idea that a Lithuanian is not a Pole and is not a Russian. A Lithuanian is a Lithuanian, and resurrecting that history was very important too.
Well, I have this question, but you've answered part of it, but would be, how much of a threat was book smuggling to the Russian Empire, in your opinion?
Well, I think probably Russia didn't think it was that much of a threat, but they obviously thought it was enough of a threat to ban the language forever, you know, it seemed like. And I think it turned out to be quite a threat because it actually organized the Lithuanians and made them much more resistant to Russification than they would have been, I think, without it.
I think so too, yes. And I've also read statistics from somewhere that these books, when they arrived in Lithuanian newspapers, they were passed around so that like one copy was not read by just one family. They were passed around, and I think the statistic is that at least 4 families read it, the material that they got.
It was a very precious thing, you know, and I love Violeta's recently, we published this book on Žemaitė, Marriage for Love, and it's Žemaitė's autobiography is in there. And at the very end of the autobiography is such a moving piece. Violeta, you tell it about how Žemaitė finally sees the language.
Well, she was sort of mentored by a neighbor, young boy who went to high school where she did not really have a chance for much education, but he eventually brought her her own work in Aušra, one of the newspapers. There were 2, Varpas and Aušra. Aušra means dawn and Varpas means bell. And the autobiography ends this way, something like, I can't look it up, but you know, in lowland, in Žemaitiškai, this is in Žemaičių language, because she is Žemaitė and she wrote the way she spoke, and the writing hadn't been standardized. So the spelling, I read the manuscripts, and the spelling is quite different. It's more like Polish, like sh, the sound sh is spelled SZ and things like that. And she's very, very excited to get her book, and especially that her writing in the newspaper. It's a surprise he brings her.
Yeah, she's absolutely delighted and surprised by the fact that this is the first time she has in her hands a book written in the Žemaičių dialect, and she's thrilled by it. So anyway, this is available on Amazon, called Marriage for Love, translated by Violeta Kelertas and Marie Terasis. So yeah, it just shows you how there was such a hunger for this in the whole country, the hunger for their own language. You know, the schools, Lithuanian schools were closed, secret schools opened up where you were teaching, and you were teaching at your own peril. And not only did kids come, but sometimes in the winter when people weren't busy with so much work, they came to this, the adults came to the secret schools to learn Lithuanian and to learn to read and write in Lithuanian as well. It's all very moving. I think it's just tremendous that this whole army of farmers rose up on their own and decided that they were not going to live without the Lithuanian language. I find that so incredible, so moving, and such a tiny country. Lithuania was not on any world map at the time. It was the Northwest territories of the mighty imperial Russian Empire. So this little speck on the map that didn't even have the word Lithuania on it, rose up mightily to keep their language alive. And, you know, there's talk that the language might have died out, actually. And I always think of Ireland as an example, you know, after how many hundreds of years of English rule, British rule, Britannia actually, you know, also forbid Gaelic, and much of Ireland does not speak Gaelic. Only the west of Ireland speaks Gaelic in the Gaelic talk areas. And I think that's so, so sad to me. So Lithuania, of course, had this cautionary tale of another Baltic language that is completely gone in the world, which is Old Prussian. We all think of Prussia now as a German area. And, you know, you might think that Old Prussian was a Germanic language, but it is not, or it was not. It was a Baltic language. And it was one of the Baltic languages that is now no longer spoken in the world. And there are only two left, Lithuanian and Latvian. So that's a cautionary tale. You know, Lithuanian could have easily gone the route of Old Prussian. And it didn't, thanks to those Lithuanians who were brave enough to do this.
Definitely. So getting back to your book, what was the most difficult part of writing The Last Book Smuggler? I'd like to hear.
Well, you know, I think it's the fact that I was not living in Lithuania. I certainly was not living in 1902 when the book starts. And I was not familiar with all of them. Writing about farmers, and I really knew very little about farm life. And I would pester my father, I would pester my brothers, you know, what did they do this time of year? What did they grow? How did they do this? How did they do that? So, and that plus the, you know, looking into all of the customs and the folk beliefs, and to try to get a flavor for what the people were like then. And I definitely didn't want to write about the nobility, although there is one sort of former nobleman, Modestas Bogdanskis, in this book, who's a Polonized Lithuanian noble and very, very poor. And but, you know, everybody who writes about that part of the world in Polish or Russian always writes about the nobility, and the peasants were not even worth writing about. And my feeling is I wanted to do just the opposite. I wanted to write about the ordinary, everyday, I don't even like calling them peasants, the ordinary, everyday farmer who worked the land, who, you know, believed in what they believed in and had their own customs. And I wanted to write about some of the pagan customs that survived really probably up until World War I. I think World War I changed that. I mean, we still have them today. We have remnants of that pagan culture in Lithuania today. But I think for the most part, people are no longer holding to all of those customs the way they did pre-World War I. But I wanted to write about those customs because I thought if they're lost ever, then, you know, someone has to write about what those people went through. So that was my impetus. And that was hard because it required a lot of reading and a lot of interviewing, a lot of help.
And what was the most rewarding part of writing that book to you?
Well, the most rewarding part was learning about all of this. You know, I mean, I knew my parents and I knew their stories, but this research into all of this I found incredibly fascinating. I couldn't get over some of these things that I learned, all of these customs and all of these superstitions. They were so funny to me in some way, but so touching in another way. You know, and how hard life was and how they had these sort of calendar feasts all throughout the year. You know, it didn't matter if it was winter, spring, summer, fall, whatever. They had a feast day for something or other, a day that they commemorated this and celebrated that. And I loved the idea of that. I loved the idea of the cohesiveness of the people, of the family, of the village life, of the parish life, of the life of the nature as well. You know, the nature was so important to every Lithuanian. You know, they were the original tree huggers, I'm sure. So that was really fabulous to learn. And I keep that in my heart now as a very special part of who I am.
So how did the writing of Lost Birds differ from the Last Book Smuggler writing?
Well,
for
you know,
you?
you always hear about, you know, writing teachers and writing programs, etc. Always write what you know. Write what you know. Don't write what you don't know. Well, Lost Birds was me writing what I know, what I had actually lived in and where I. Lost Birds is all about Lithuanian emigres. Most of the book happens, not all, but most of it happens in Chicago, although there is a section in Los Angeles and a section in Lithuania. But I wrote there things that I knew about, the people I knew about, and I was actually had pulled away from Lithuanians. You know, I said, I'm in America, I want to see what the wider world is like. I want to meet new and interesting people, you know, and I had grown up with Lithuanian scouts, Lithuanian this, Lithuanian Saturday school, Lithuanian that. And I kind of was really hungry for more, for, you know, let me meet other people. But the further I got away from the Lithuanian community and the Lithuanian organizations, the more I started remembering things that would make me laugh or cry or think about all of the, and characters started coming into my mind about people that I would remember that were from that old neighborhood. And so I wrote about them, and those were things I knew. But the book Smuggler was writing about what you don't know, what you don't even have the slightest idea of what you're writing about. So it was, but my writing, I don't usually plan in advance. What I do is I have characters in my head and a setting in my head, and the story starts growing in me, and growing and developing, and I'm following the character to find out what my story is about. That's how I write. I write. Violeta reminded me this morning. She said, "Tell them about how you write in the shower." I actually had friends buy me paper that was waterproof and a pen that was waterproof, so I could write these things down while in the shower. I step in the shower and it's like a whole world starts coming to life for me, and a whole scene starts developing, and I have to stay in that shower until it's finished. Sometimes I come out and the tips of my fingers are wrinkled, but I don't know what happens to me in the shower, but I hear I'm not alone. I hear other writers do the same thing. It's the same thing with music. I come across a piece of music that puts me in some sort of state, you know, some sort of state of mind. And I know that I played Mozart's Requiem, the Lacrimosa section, on feedback. You know, it would keep looping back and back, because it would put me in this state of mind that I needed for these next chapters that were very sad. And so I just kept playing it over and over again until I finished whatever section of the novel that I needed. So I'm very influenced by music. Music really does put me in a state. And what I found was that all I had to do was put the music on and I was back in that scene, which was just amazing to me, much like the shower is amazing to me. So writers have all of their strange little quirks. I'm sure everybody has their own strange quirk, but those are my strange quirks, and they work for me.
Well, the Paris Review has very long and interesting interviews that they publish with writers, but I've never read or heard anyone that's quite as interesting as you are about your writing process, and especially the shower thing. And I meant to say before, when you were talking about, you know, not calling people peasants, I have the same problem, and I've been fighting it for many years because lots of sociology books, history books, even today, they're calling people peasants in Lithuania. And I mean, sure, you know, when they were serfs, they maybe were peasants, but there was a program in Chicago at the main library, I think, and one of Birute's and my friends, but then we didn't know each other, she didn't know him either, but Vytautas Martinkus from Kaunas then probably, or maybe he was already living in Vilnius, he was invited, and Tomas Venclava was there, and Czesław Miloš was there. It was a big event in Chicago, and there was a questions and answers at the end of it. And somebody asked Martinkus what his background was. And he said, or who raised him? And he said, I was a peasant. And the whole hall just went, oh, a peasant. You know? And I was so unhappy with that because he was born in 1943. And there were no peasants, you know, farmers were independent. His parents had a farm of their own, so what peasant? But you know, I don't know why this sticks for so many decades and centuries, probably.
Well, and it has such a terrible connotation, peasant, as if you're not even to be reckoned with. You don't even matter. You're just some sort of
and you're stupid.
and
yeah. And you can't read and that kind of thing. Yeah.
I wanted to write about these people because they're tremendous people, people of the earth, you know, and the soil tenders, the bread eaters, the soil tenders. I think they were so important to the culture. Anyway, I'm with you.
Well, Lithuania was an agricultural country until 1964, when it became more urbanized. And the cities were half of the population of any city in Lithuania was at least 50% were Jewish, merchants and etc. But let's get back to our topic. What were the most challenging aspects of being a writer to you?
Well, I think it's what I talked about earlier. Well, although there is some, I mean, being a woman and working and having a family leaves you very little time to write. And that was to me always very frustrating and very, you know, I would hire a babysitter sometimes out of desperation and go run off to the corner cafe and write like mad for an hour. What was, I think, more challenging than that was starting out writing and trying to put it out in the world in literary magazines, etc., was the idea that you could be a writer, you know, like every little insecurity and every demon that you have, and we all have them, you know, every demon in the world, when I would sit down to write, would start whispering in my ears, who do you think you are that you think you're a writer? You know, the insecurity of it was tremendous. And it didn't help that when I would send my work out to publishers, or mainly to publishers, they would all say to me, well, who would want to read a book about Lithuania? You know, that, as if it was such a tiny little country that it would have an audience of 5 or something like that. And so they didn't seem at all interested in any of these topics. So that was very, very upsetting for me. And I thought, gee, people are interested in Amy Tan and her growing up Chinese, and people are interested in Isabel Allende and her growing up in Chile. Why wouldn't they? They're interested in Galeano and all of these other interesting sort of ethnic writers. Why wouldn't they be interested in Lithuania? So that was very challenging to me. But that and probably my own insecurities, because really, who am I to write? You know, I'm just a English literature teacher in high school. And but I always sort of had that little little
Drive.
that little wish that would make me happy to do that. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to write for myself, and if anybody wants to read this, fine, and if they don't, fine, but I'll make myself happy.
That's a good reason enough. I'm curious what made you include magical realism in the Last Book Smuggler. I think you had some in Lost Birds too. Both of the books had it.
Right, and this next book is going to have it as well. I love magical realism. I love and adored 100 Years of Solitude by
Gabriel Marquez. Garcia Marquez.
Yes, I loved Allende's book, The House of Spirits, with all of the spirits coming alive. I especially loved Isaac Bashevis Singer, when he would write about all the devils and all of the spirits in the shtetls of Poland. And I loved Shalom Aleichem, and how he would, always argue with God and, God, why did you make this happen? And, so on and so on. I found all of that charming. And I started thinking, what would the Lithuanian version be? And I had read Kazys Birutės Baltaragio Malūnas, which, how does that translate in Lithuanian?
Whitehorn's Windmill.
Whitehorn's Windmill, which
has been translated and published by Elizabeth Novickas.
Novickas' great book, that she published. But it has a lot of that in there, and I love that book, Baltaragio Malūnas. I loved it because this miller was besieged by devils and all sorts of things, and I started thinking, well, let me do more in that vein. Let me get something where there are some devils. And my father, of course, told the story of the Domovoi, which is his tata, which is his aunt brought back from Russia. She was working in Russia as a domestic servant for a very rich Jewish family. And she came back from there and came back home to where my father lived. But she had brought this Domovoi with her that sticks only to old maids. And he said to me, "Oi, the Russians have so many demons." They said, there's a demon for the house, which is a Domovoi. There's a demon for the yard. There's a demon for the river. There's a demon for the lake. There's a demon for the bathhouse. There's a, it went on and on like that. And I thought, oh, that sounds so interesting. Let me look into that. But anyway, I took his story of the Domovoi and put it into both Lost Birds and into the book smuggling book. And God knows it may even show up in Winter Flowers, but though I doubt it, but I just love it. Somehow the whole idea that there's a whole unseen world that affects you, an unseen world of spirits and influences and magical things that happen. Certainly as Catholics, we all believe in miracles, they just happen overnight. And I certainly stuck a lot of miracles into Lost Birds because I always thought the idea was sort of interesting and wanted to see what it would look like in a modern setting. Woody Allen does this in one of his movies called Alice, where one of his ancestors suddenly appears in a cloud in the sky and starts giving him hell for something he did in his life, like, you didn't do this or you shouldn't have done that, and don't forget aunt this and this. And I thought that was so funny. So I like things like that, and they tickle me. And so if I want to, they say no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. So I also think no laughs in the writer, no laughs in the reader. And I would like to tickle my readers as well, to give them the tears that, that a hard life gives, and the laughter that the absurdities of life give. That's my goal.
I think there are more of these spirits like in the northern part of Europe, or maybe it's just because I'm familiar with it, having lived in Sweden and Lithuania. And the Swedes certainly have them. They have the tomtes, you know, and some of them are good, some of them are bad, and they do all the work at night for the farmers, etc. And Lithuanians have aitvaras and all kinds too. And the Russians obviously have them. So I wonder, you know, I don't know anything about that aspect, but it seems like they're common, more common up there. Finland with the mummies or whatever the kids are all reading, or adults still talk about it, the trolls, etc.
Well, I remember being in LA when Maria Gimbutas, this is her year, I guess, but when Maria Gimbutas was still living in Los Angeles, she was living in Topanga Canyon, and she had this lovely house there. And she used to invite a lot of people to come and listen to her give speeches about, give a lecture about the spirit world. And she would talk about things like the Laumes, which I actually took right from her. I have the Laumes in the Book Smuggler, I think, right? Writing the new book.
Maybe in the next book.
But anyway,
I don't remember them, but
they came to every birth to decide, is this going to be what you know, and they had certain rhymes that they used to say at every birth, trying to decide the fate of the baby. And this all came from Maria Gimbutas' talk. And she used to give her talk in her house, and she had this whole wall of devils that she had collected that were hanging in the whole wall. And I would look at these devils and I would think, oh, these are marvelous. And I remember asking her about them, and she said, oh, there's a devil for every household. And there's, you know, you drop a spoon, what devil is here about? You know, you drop, you know, whatever, your laundry gets ruined, what the devil, you know, there's a devil for every day and for every activity. And so I loved her lectures and took copious notes as she was talking. And she was a wonderful, wonderful speaker and a very warm and welcoming woman. And we went there often for these events, and they made a big impression on me.
yes, she's fabulous. And there have been already, I don't know, at least three conferences about her in Lithuania, and more coming, because she's, although they have more than one person that they honor per year, but she's one of the major ones. And there's going to be more. We're trying to figure out something for Santara, and there's a young woman who graduated from Central European University with a PhD dissertation on Maria's work. And she's really very good. And there are things that I had never heard about from her, about Maria's work and her ideas. So you've answered most of my questions, but you know, who are the writers you admire most? You mentioned some of them, but do you have any others? The ones that you did mention were kind of similar to each other. They gave you some kind of pattern, but you have other writers, I'm sure, that you like very much.
Well, I absolutely adore all the Russians. I love Tolstoy. I love anything by Turgenev. I love anything by Chekhov. Anna Karenina I must have read I don't know how many times. Brothers Karamazov is one of my favorites of all time. So I love all of those. I love anything written in the 19th century. It seems like I love those writers better than the modern ones. I love a good story. So I'm not a big fan of postmodernism or any of the other really. I'm not a big fan of James Joyce, for example.
Did you read him though? Did you read Ulysses?
I
Or
tried.
did you suffer through it?
I tried many times to read Ulysses, and I would always get to the same page, somewhere around 56 or something. And I would be so frustrated by that point that I would throw the book across the room. Someone would then start talking about, oh, the best book in the world, the best book ever written, the best book this. And I actually started taking a class at the local community college. A professor from Ireland was teaching a long class where he was going into every little detail of it. I also didn't last in that class. I couldn't, I just don't have the patience for it.
Well, you know where your niche is. And you,
I don't have the patience for that. I know you, Violeta, are a huge fan of Proust, another one I could never stand finishing. So
yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, we've had different childhoods. I had to spend a lot of time reading because we lived upstairs from the landlady, and I wasn't allowed to jump around, and I wasn't allowed to go outside because somebody would abduct me and things like that. And so all I could do was sit and read. And so, you know, it was, and my father had lots of books, so I read them all. Anyway, let's get back to the present. And I think people really are very interested to hear in what you were working on now.
Well, Winter Flowers, and strangely enough, Winter Flowers was written before the Book Smuggler, but it's now going to be book 2, so it's requiring tremendous rewriting. But strangely enough, I wrote Winter Flowers first. And my writing group, which I talked about earlier, kept saying, wait a minute, we want to hear more about Ada. Tell us about her when she was younger, you know, give us Ada when she was 18 or something. So I would dutifully go home and write a new chapter about Ada at 18. So then the next time I would read it, they would say, no, younger than that. We want to know about her family. Then I would go home and write about her family. And then they would say, no, let's hear more about that character and this character. So I ended up writing Book Smuggler, the whole book. I ended up writing backwards, if you can believe it, which of course meant that it didn't quite flow very well and I had to do extensive rewriting. But Winter Flowers was written before, and it's about World War I. It's about when Lithuania gets its independence, declares its independence from Russia, and it's when they have to fight the wars of independence, especially against Poland. And as I said, part of my father's memoir, the one that wasn't lost, the part that's about the wars against Poland, are in that book. And I'm in the process of rewriting it right now. And COVID has certainly put a dent in my doing that, since I had COVID, and it's been a crazy year. And we were in Lithuania for the book fair.
Yeah.
A lot of time has been taken away from the rewriting of this, but it's on its way. It's happily on its way now.
Well, tell us about what's buzzing in volume 3.
Well, volume 3, I think Lithuania's biggest trauma and biggest, I think, wound is World War II. And that's book 3 is tentatively called Dark Moon. And it's about World War II, and it's pretty brutal. And it's brutal because of the Holocaust, but it's brutal because the Russians really were incredibly horrible to Lithuania and left a Lithuania that was devastated. It's the time, of course, that my parents and Violeta's parents fled Lithuania at the end of the war to get away from that because they were on the deportation lists. And Violeta tells an incredible story about her family crossing the Baltic Sea to get to Sweden. We ran into Germany, which was the only place to run at that point that wasn't Russian. Had we been caught, we would have all been in Siberia or dead. But so I'm writing about all of that. And it's, I think, going to be the hardest book to write. because it's such a traumatic time for everybody. Whether you're Lithuanian, Jewish, Polish, whatever, it's just a time when I think Lithuania's darkest days, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, thank you, Birute. I think the plan now is to turn the floor over to Agne, consul of in Los Angeles, Lithuanian consul Agne Gurevičienė, and she will lead the Q&A. And hopefully people will have questions. I don't know if there are any or not, but there most likely there are. So Agne.
Thank you, Violeta. There are some questions, and if you do have a question, I encourage you to put it in our Q&A or raise your hand. And one question is from Mr. Nakas. You partly answered that question, but maybe you'll have, Birute, more comments about that. As someone who writes about Lithuania, do you think that perhaps your work and the works of others who write on Lithuania doesn't receive as much attention as it deserves by a Western audience, perhaps because they see it as a tiny speck? So maybe you could comment and tell us more about the audiences of your book, because those are in English.
Well, I'll tell you, most of my audience, probably has some Lithuanian roots in it, but for when I do read it to an all-American audience, they are absolutely fascinated by this. It's a history they don't know much about, but they're curious, they're interested, they seem to enjoy it, they want to know more about it. Whenever I've done this presentation to an all-American audience that's not Lithuanians, they are, I think, very interested in it. But for some reason, publishers and other people like that just don't seem to be interested in it. And I think it's the idea of where would the audience come from? And I think there's more of an audience than people realize from what I have encountered. So I don't know, it's a problem, and I don't know if it'll ever really resolve, but I'm telling the story whether there's an audience or not. So
thank you very much. And there is a question from Ms. Budreika. How can we encourage people, especially the younger generation and those born outside of Lithuania, to speak and read and write in Lithuanian? Do you have any advice?
Oh gosh, I wish I had some advice, because I did not instill Lithuanian language and writing into my own children. I tried, I put them in Saturday school for 3 years. I certainly spoke to them in Lithuanian, but they seemed to resent it, because once they started going to preschool, that was it. It was all over. They didn't want to speak Lithuanian again. And I regret it to this day, and so do they. They now tell me, Mama, I took them to Lithuania. They fell in love with Lithuania. They want me to get citizenship. They want to get citizenship. We all want to go to another trip again. They want me to buy something in Vilnius so that they could go and stay there. So it's now become one of the big regrets of my life, and their lives as well. But maybe we can remedy this still. But I think it's very important, very, very important to teach. If you have the language, to teach it to your children. And I think by reading about Lithuania and making it more, more alive, the way my father did for me. My mother had never talked about Lithuania. She was too traumatized by it. She never talked about it. She didn't want to talk about it. She had been questioned by the NKVD and tortured and all of this because my father was doing underground work, anti-Soviet underground work. And she was so traumatized by that, she didn't want to talk about any of it. But my father did, thankfully, and he has a very resilient and bright spirit, sort of a happy spirit. So I think he brought that all to life for me, so I could bring it to life for someone else. And many an American Lithuanian has reached out to me and said, thank you for giving me that history of my my grandparents, my ancestors. So I think it's important to keep this all alive, but how to do it in Lithuanian? Well, I'm hopelessly, I was hopelessly lost in this regard myself. So.
Thank you for your thoughts. And in our audience, we have Los Angeles Lithuanian, Kęstutis Kazlauskas. Hello, Kęstutis. And I see your raised hands. Perhaps you want to ask your questions directly to Birute. So you can, I think you're allowed to talk now.
Okay, thanks. There were just a couple of comments I wanted to make. I've read parts of your other book, and I've been at this next book you're working on, you're going to be working on, talking about World War II and Lithuania is very complicated, and it's very hard to do because, you know, and you have to keep in mind, and I'm just giving you advice because I've been at my thing for about 10 years now. You know,
You're writing a book, Kęstutis?
Yeah, I'll tell another time. I'll talk about that. But when you talk about history and World War II, and you think of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, you think of all these countries, Baltic countries, and then the world powers that are moving in and out. You know, but let's say between Germany and Russia, you've got a situation where you have to realize that Lithuania did not evolve in a vacuum. You know, there's Polish influence, there's Russian influence, there's German influence, there's Jewish influence. And it's very hard to write any sort of historical thing without really ticking off somebody. You know, you can't be, there's like, I got a young cousin who did a presentation in Vilnius, and this is the history of Vilnius. Well, you know, and it's translated in different languages, and you put headphones on and you can listen to the history of Vilnius in Russian, German, English, Lithuanian, but it's the same script. And I would imagine, I kept thinking that every Pole sitting there would have been thinking, well, how come they didn't mention much more about Poland? Or every Jew who was sitting there would have, you know, been thinking, well, gee, they should have said more about Jews. Or Lithuanians were thinking, well, you know, ethnic Lithuanians would have been thinking they should have said more about Lietuviai here, you know. And so there's all this stuff, you know, that can't be answered without offending somebody or neglecting somebody. Or so that's just the one lesson that I've been learning, and I'm dealing with it. Another thing, when you were talking about coming to the new world, I enjoyed that because there's that same kind of feeling. I'm a DP from a DP camp also, you know, and when I got here, I'm a Lietuvis at home, you know, I'm Kęstutis, but I'm also Casey because my school teacher said, "What's your name?" Kęstutis. What? You know, no, your name is not Kęstutis. It's Casey. Okay, so to every English kid, I was Casey, but when I got together at home and with the Lithuanian community, I was Kęstutis. And then as I became a teenager, I'm becoming more and more Canadian. And when I'm becoming Canadian, you know, I want to be even more Canadian than I am Lithuanian, but I have something holding me back, and that's my culture. So, and that's that. How do I try at that time? You know, it was a conflict kind of. So, what do I do? How do I? And I was also an artist. So, how do I reconcile that? And I saw a graphic one time, and the name of it was something like "Roots and Wings." You know, and here's this eagle that's, you know, just poised to fly in very dramatic composition. And I look, but the talons are on the ground, and from the talons, roots are growing, you know, and there's no way this eagle's going to fly, you know, just no way. And it's roots and wings, and it's contradiction, you know. And then I looked at that like Chinese sweet and sour sauce, you know. Well, I'm used to sweet and I'm used to sour, but how can you make something that's both, you know? And then I realized that you can't set it up that way. You know, you're both. It's roots and wings. It's kind of inherent contradictions, and then you go from there. You use that as an advantage, and it's never, you know, set up as a conflict. So that was the other point I wanted to make. But I appreciate your work, and I'm glad you're on here. I finally got to see, although we never met really, but I want to meet you sometime.
Okay, great.
All right.
Absolutely. Kęstuti, I'm all for it.
Well, we'll talk.
New writing group, perhaps.
That's right.
So I think we have the last questions about the last of the book smugglers. So Evelina is asking, Birute, could you tell us about why you chose to write about the last of the book smugglers? Were you perhaps making a literary allusion to The Last of the Mohicans by Cooper? What is your message to the reader? Is there any story about this?
Well, I didn't want to write about the whole period because I didn't want to get into the early book smugglers, and I didn't want to get into all of Basanavičius and Valančius and all of that. I just wanted to write about a family. And I wanted to write about an old book smuggler who was already tired of 40 years of trying to keep his language alive, 40 years of struggle. And the only person that's helping him is his granddaughter, Ada. And so I also wanted it to be a love story. And so I also wanted to celebrate the end of the book smuggling. So because of that, he had to be one of the last of the book smugglers, the last one. And he was able to see the book smuggling be finished. So for that reason, he was the last book smuggler, this Viktoras and Ada. But I love the idea of the last of the Mohicans. I'd never thought of that, but I think it's an apt comparison, certainly, because not that they, thank God we didn't need book smugglers after this man was finished. 1904, the book smuggling ban was lifted, thank goodness. And we have our language back.
Thank you very much. And if there are no further questions, so I sincerely thank you, Birute. Thank you, Violeta, for your interesting and honest and open discussion, and everyone who was part of it. I hope you enjoyed this afternoon and got some inspiration from Birute, from Violeta, also from book smugglers. And let's spend this weekend with a book of Birute Putrius or Violeta Kelertas or any other book about Lithuania in Lithuanian. So let's do it. And thank you very much. Goodbye.